All of you to the Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies at Columbia. My name is Turkish Studies. I teach political science here at Columbia, and I am currently the director of the Sabancı Center. And I want to welcome you all to this very timely and exciting event. Before I introduce our speakers, let me situate what this event is all about. So I assume that all of us in this room are smart and discerning consumers rather than producers of news content. There may be some exceptions, obviously our speakers are exceptions. And I also expect that with the diversification of information sources over the past decade or two, many of us experience a profound sense of vertigo and disorientation in navigating the news and the information environment more broadly. So whereas just a couple of decades ago, an informed citizen could more or less feel like they had a grasp of the basic media sources available to them, that is to say, have some idea of the available sources, what they were, and follow them in a kind of mind, with an awareness of their particular perspectives and sometimes with biases. Today that task is essentially intractable for anyone but professional media watchers. To use a culinary metaphor, back in the midst of time, say in 2004, we as members of the public could look around our media plates and easily identify what was being dished out. You could say, I recognize this is an egg, it could be scrambled, it could be fried, maybe it's menemen, but you could identify it as an egg. And frequently we could also, even if we wanted to, source the chicken that laid the egg. Today the plate looks substantially different. It's often heaped full of unrecognizable, hyper-processed stuff that may or may not be edible, and you often have no idea where it came from. So if I want to find out about, let's say, an ongoing investigation in Turkey, or whether that tweet about an immigration raid ongoing in Harlem is true, my search is going to turn up a variety of sources with very partial, unreferenced, confusing sources of information with a heavy dose of dating, weight loss, and toe fungus ads elbowing their way into my vision. But getting reliable and accurate information about what's happening in our society and our world is, of course, more important than ever in this period of open mendacity and manipulation, periodic crises like rampant military aggression, pandemics, humanitarian crises, and more. We've never been more conscious of our reliance on and acute need for journalists who uphold the time-honored norms of their profession, sometimes at profound personal risk. The importance of the media and journalism in sustaining free and open societies is often understated. And if we were to identify political freedom with democracy, we often identify democracy with voting. My own discipline of political science is often guilty of equating democracy with electoralism. But we've seen particularly clearly in the past few years that elections have very little democratic value in the absence of an informed public that has access to a plurality of sources of information. And we're all finding out, recall my stomach churning food metaphor from earlier, that plurality of information sources is not enough. We need the institutions that provide us with this vital good that we call information to adhere to rigorous norms of independence, fairness, transparency, integrity, and so on. And the capacity of media institutions and journalists to uphold those standards is facing a number of challenges. So to help us understand these challenges and how they manifest themselves in authoritarian or transitional contexts in particular, we welcome two distinguished journalists with extensive expertise reporting from a variety of contexts and in a variety of formats. Ann Cooper is Professor Emerita at Columbia Journalism School. She served as NPR's first Moscow bureau chief, so countless Americans originally learned about the tumultuous events of the final years of the Soviet Union through her voice. She co-edited a key book about that period entitled Russia at the Barricades, Eyewitness Accounts of the August 1991 Coup. And she has continued to write about the glasnost era, the subsequent decline of press freedom in Russia, and Russia's global media strategy. Cooper also reported on South Africa's first inclusive democratic elections in 1994 after the fall of apartheid. In addition to being an award-winning journalist and foreign correspondent with more than 25 years of radio and print reporting experience, she also worked for 8 years as the executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is a preeminent press freedom advocacy group, as I'm sure you know. So, and thank you for joining us. And our other speaker will be Diego Cupolo, who is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Turkey Recap, which is an English and Turkish language news platform on Turkish politics, foreign policy, economy, and business. As part of Turkey Recap, Diego hosts Recap Radio, which is a series of conversations with diverse experts about current issues related to Turkey, which is a vital part of my personal podcast diet. Cupolo has been based in Turkey since 2015 as a multimedia journalist. I should highlight that the image on our beautiful poster there is Diego's own. And he has contributed to a range of publications, including The Atlantic, The Economist, Foreign Policy, The Financial Times, to name a few. In 2018, his reporting on Turkish politics received honorable mention in the World Justice Project's Lewis Prize for exceptional rule of law journalism. And if there was a Pulitzer for best puns, Turkish Recap would certainly sweep that category. For example, this morning's Turkey Recap newsletter, which I highly encourage those of you who are interested in Turkish politics to subscribe to, examined the tendentious ceasefire between the Syrian government and the Kurdish-led forces, entitled House of Kurds. I appreciate, in a grim news environment, I appreciate that touch. So I'm a political scientist interested in democratic backsliding, and I'm very, very grateful to you for being willing to share your experience and expertise with us today. I feel a little bit awkward in my role, and I'm going to sit down in a minute. After all, you guys are the pros at asking questions, so I feel like that kid who gets to be mayor for a day. So bear with me as I try this out. And my first question to you is going to be to just tell our audience a little bit about your experiences reporting from Russia, Turkey, and elsewhere. Journalism, as we can imagine, is not an easy career, and you've both had some particularly challenging beats. So if you would start by telling us a little bit about those and what motivates you to face these challenges, I think that would be interesting to our audience.
Okay. I went to Moscow at the very end of 1986. It was still, Russia was part of the Soviet Union at that point. And I ended up writing quite regularly about media, about the press, because the press had been so controlled. The Communist Party that ruled the Soviet Union understood that controlling information was essential to them hanging on to power. They had a censor in every newsroom. Journalists were members of the Communist Party, but there was always a censor there just in case something might, they might try to slip something through that the Kremlin did not want the public to know about. Things began to change very quickly, or it had begun to change when I got there, but it escalated in 1987, 1988. Mikhail Gorbachev was in power. Among his most important policy changes was glasnost, which is sometimes referred to as press freedom. It wasn't. Openness is a better translation of the term, and certainly of the policy as it played out. Why do I say that? Because Gorbachev thought he can actually control this process and allow journalists some more freedom over here. He wanted to reform the economy. Well, people have been told for decades, the economy's great, the 5-year plan, we over-fulfilled it yet again, comrades. And he needs the public to know that that was not true. that wasn't true in the late 1980s, and therefore, set things up for economic reform. But he didn't necessarily want them writing about a whole bunch of other things that journalists began to push forward on and start reporting on: Stalin's crimes, the Gulag, so many things that had been swept under the rug or airbrushed out of history. And pretty soon Gorbachev lost control of this process. Journalists became heroes in this era. People were thrilled to be able to actually, read good journalism, to read the truth, in many cases, truths that have been buried for such a long time. And so by the time the Soviet Union collapsed at the end of 1991, journalists were seen as among the heroes whose work had contributed to that collapse. And so then in the 1990s, you had this period, early 90s at least, this flowering of journalism. People wanted to become journalists. People wanted to create new independent newspapers. They created radio stations, some really fine TV channels all around the country. And the West was encouraging this. USAID, which no longer does this, gave a lot of money to support the development of independent journalism, to teach Russian journalists and journalists in other former Soviet republics, how to do investigative reporting, journalistic ethics, all of these kind of basic things that had not been operable or pursuable during the Soviet era. So it's a pretty exciting period, but there were two big problems in the 90s. One was violence. There's this huge, that wars began between mafia-like gangs trying to control property or resources, the raw resources that Russia had in such abundance, or lucrative enterprises, factories. And journalists who tried to cover this sometimes ended up dead or threatened in some way. There was a young journalist who covered the military, and the military didn't like his coverage, and he received a package bomb that exploded and killed him one day. Paul Klebnikov, who was a Russian-American journalist, the editor of Forbes magazine, which did some great investigative reporting on these issues of, economics and the mafia wars and stuff in the early 90s. Paul Klebnikov was gunned down on the street in Moscow. I mean, it was a pretty violent and lawless period. Of course, nobody was ever brought to trial in almost any of these murders of journalists. The other thing that was even more pervasive was money. So the Communist Party and the Soviet government, which was really the party was the government was the party, subsidized all of the media. Those subsidies are gone now. And there's no tradition of advertising. People used to pay a few kopecks for their newspapers, so you're not going to be able to charge a lot of money and pay your bills and pay your reporters by jacking up subscription prices. And so this is a terrible situation for virtually all the media. Things started to happen like politicians coming to an editor of the local paper and saying, I'm running for re-election, and if you can write some nice stuff about me and some bad stuff about my opponents, there's some money in it for you. And you can pay your bills, you can pay your reporters, who sometimes would go months at a time without getting their salaries. The reporters were very vulnerable. A businessman might come to them and say, I just started this new business, will you write a nice review of it for me? And by the way, here's an envelope of money. Or, will you go after my competitors and say how terrible they are so that, I can take over the market? So now you know, we're into the 90s, and that wonderful, you know, hero image of the journalist is getting pretty tarnished. And there are reports about how, you know, journalists are on the take, and they begin to lose public trust. The financial situation persists. If you're going to stay in business, a lot of journalists felt the only way I can continue doing this job and feeding my family is to take some money for writing some stories, you know, favorable stories or smear stories about somebody, whatever. So it becomes a very messy situation, you know, plummeting trust. There are some oligarchs, some of the guys who did grab those resources and made a lot of money out of it, or, you know, grabbed a business like the Togliatti Auto Works, and, you know, they decided, I'm going to build a media company and, you know, use their money in that way. They might tell their journalists, you know, I don't like this guy over here, you need to write something about him. But by and large, there were two oligarchs in particular whose media outlets were seen as very independent, except for the occasional, you know, smear job on somebody that they didn't like. So the whole picture of independent media is shifting some. There is this, you know, cluster of very good journalism that's going on. It's oligarch finance because there really isn't another alternative that, except for, you know, taking dirty money. And then you have, you know, all of this other stuff. And where, you know, where journalists are compromising themselves ethically and losing the trust of the people that they're trying to inform. And so that takes us through the 90s, and here we are at 2000. Boris Yeltsin has just resigned and said, this guy, Vladimir Putin, he's my replacement. And by that time, I had gone to the Committee to Protect Journalists, but maybe we want to talk more about Putin a little bit later.
Sounds good. Thank you for that introduction.
Oh boy. So, I don't know where to start, but I wanted to, you know, all of us are thinking about the present moment, and you have Trump, I have Erdogan. And if there's one thing you're going to remember, it would be exhaustion is the point. They're trying to exhaust you. They're trying to make it hard to follow the news. That's my job. I'm very tired sometimes. I do it because I love to follow the news. I've always done it in my life. I think I owe that to my father, who always had magazines around the house. And when you feel like you can't keep up with the news, and there's so much changing, and there's this talk about Greenland while conflicts happening in Syria, and we don't see that conflict on the front page of many newspapers, that's the point. Exhaustion's the point, diversion's the point, controlling the narrative is the point, and when you control the narrative, you control what people say, and what they discuss, and what the hell's going on with Greenland? Somebody help me out here. From what I understand, people are talking, and then the news is talking about people talking. So when you're moving ships to Iran, when you're moving troops, you cover that. When people are talking and you cover that as your main news story, the media is complicit. And this is how you run an authoritarian government. I think that you all are very shaken by what Trump is doing. I was always a very liberal, progressive person. I lived in Brooklyn in the 2000s. When Trump won in 2016, I was shocked because I thought his candidacy was a joke. I think many people thought that. We were wrong, obviously. When he won this time, the second one, I spent 10 years in Turkey by that time. I moved to Turkey permanently in 2015. I had been there before, but after 10 years in Turkey, watching Trump 2.0, it feels like home. Like, this is what we deal with in Turkey. You're just constantly bombarded with news headlines about this place, that place, Venezuela, Iran. this, Greenland. I don't know what's going to happen next week. And then that suffocates the oxygen out of the room for other stories. So my mission and journalist mission should be focusing on what matters and what's actually happening in the world. And that's hard to do because the business structure, right? Whether it's oligarchs, whether it's commercial incentives, or whether it's influencers on TikTok, I think the main issue we have now in media is what's the difference between a journalist and an influencer? And I have an answer for that. Journalists are transparent. We say when we have conflicts of interest. An influencer can get money from anyone. They can have a Trump coin and get finance from different people and support their narratives. I should say now, before we talk further, my wife is a politician. I say this all the time. I know that's okay for very famous people, but it's not okay for less rich or less known journalists to have conflicts of interest. I'm very open about this. This happened, it was unplanned. We can go into the backstory. My interest is human rights. It doesn't matter whose human rights. I support human rights for everybody and rule of law. So, what do we do now? Let's not be exhausted. And I can talk more about specific issues, but to give a background for people that don't know our work, maybe I should say, we monitor Turkey news because it's very difficult to monitor it, and if you just focus on what Erdogan says, you're missing the plot. Turkey has a 60-year drought. My city, Ankara, is running out of water, possibly by June. But we're talking about what Erdogan says every day, and not that drought. That's what happens in authoritarian regimes.
So there's a lot, thank you for those very rich introductions. There's a lot there to pick up on, and it's hard to pick, but I hope we will get to many of the themes that you've introduced. One that I guess that was in both of your remarks, at least implicitly, was that was the observation that there's authoritarian regimes also have media strategies that are sort of part of the way that they exercise, part of the way that they wield power. And we were talking about this offline a little bit over email, so I wanted to bring that conversation to our audience about how exactly authoritarian regimes try to, attack is a strong word because it's not just attacking, it's also manipulating, right? It's also kind of trying to shape the narratives that are refracted through media organizations and kind of strategies like consolidating ownership, through sort of allies. Or you can go to, and perhaps you could talk about sort of the fine and taxes and those kinds of investigations, all the way to what you mentioned, which is sort of assassinating journalists when the narrative doesn't suit powerful players, let's say. So how do you assess the role of these various media control strategies within the authoritarian playbook? I realize that's, an editor would probably ding me for using that hackneyed phrase, but how do you see that those strategies as sort of fitting within the way that authoritarians strategize about power?
Are you saying the authoritarian playbook is the
Playbook.
hack? Okay.
Yeah.
So I hear, a lot of references to Trump is using so-and-so's playbook. And when it comes to press freedom, people will say he's following Viktor Orban's playbook, Viktor Orban of Hungary. And I go, no, he's not, because Orban was following Putin's playbook. So if I can go back to the beginning of when Putin came to office, because I think he didn't necessarily originate all these things, but like when I came to the Committee to Protect Journalists in, I think it was 1998, we would put out every year the list of journalists killed because of their work, the journalists in prison because of their work. That still exists, but there are so many other ways now in which these authoritarians go after the media, and some of them are more subtle. They don't require them to do, Trump-like social media posts about, so-and-so is the most terrible journalist ever, unethical, blah, blah, blah. And Putin, I think, if he didn't necessarily originate all these, he really, turned it into an art form, I guess. I hate to use that term. But so he came to power January of 2000. The presidency was just handed to him. He's like a pretty unknown guy. We know he's a KGB agent. That's bad. But he had been a top aide to the Leningrad mayor, who was a revered small d Democrat. So, how does that go together with the KGB agent? Would the Leningrad mayor actually have an evil person working for him? And so, a while back, I was doing some research for a report about all this, and I looked back at stories written at the time, and there was a lot of head scratching. And this is like, U.S. foreign correspondents. Who is this guy really, and what will he do? And some of it was kind of positive speculation. Okay, at the Committee to Protect Journalists, we're like almost immediately hearing from journalists about things that happen to them that are not good, let's say. And so he comes to power in January. In March, he has to stand for election. And we put out a report shortly before the election, and I'm just so proud of this phrase that we had in there, that there are ominous signs that independent journalism faces a bleak future under the Putin regime. I'm sorry to say we were absolutely right, but most people at that time were still kind of scratching their heads. Who is this guy? Can we show that picture?
Sure.
But this was based on what journalists were telling us. Okay, then this thing happens, I think it was April. This is a scene in Moscow in April of 2000. So he's only been in office for like 3 months or something. And I thought of this picture the other day after looking at a lot of pictures of ICE guys. This maybe doesn't look quite as intimidating, but guess who these guys are? They're tax police. And they are at Media Most, which is this big, it's the media company owned by one of the oligarchs, Vladimir Gusinski. They have a very good newspaper, they have a very good magazine, and they have a terrific national TV channel, news channel. Putin doesn't like any of that, of course. He'd love to see it go away. But he's not out there denouncing. Of course, there was no social media, there was no internet. But he could have, been complaining about the terrible coverage that he was getting. Didn't have to do that. He could send the tax police to this media company. Almost nobody was paying their taxes in Russia at that point. But this is one of the few places where you saw this kind of intimidation. Very deliberate, balaclavas, semi-automatic weapons. I think they got on bulletproof vests. Anyway, it was like shocking. So now people are kind of getting it, what he's all about. They arrest Gusinski, the oligarch, put him in jail, tell him, we'll let you out and you can leave the country if you'll give up Media Most, your media holdings. And Gusinski takes a deal, leaves the country. Government's got hold of Media Most and gives it to Gazprom. What is Gazprom? It is the natural gas monopoly. What does it have to do with media? Not really anything, but it does understand something that is now becoming clear to the media. If you want to have no trouble in the Putin regime, be a Kremlin loyalist. And that's exactly what Gazprom turns NTV into. It's gone from this amazing TV channel to now, just a loyalist mouthpiece, really. Many of the journalists exit. They try their hand at a couple of other stations, but they never recreate exactly what they had with NTV. All of that is done without saying NTV is a terrible thing or suing them for libel or anything like that. And this is, I guess this is an example of state capture, which was not a term that I understood at the time, certainly very familiar in Turkey, and it's happened in Russia. So I see this as the beginning of the Putin playbook that now has been copied by so many. And what's involved in it? It's using things like the tax police, or, you know, your business registration isn't right. I know we heard, I can't remember which media outlet it was, but I know we heard from one media outlet in the early days that they were shut down for a fire code violation. They were reopened after a few days, but the message was clear. We're going to keep coming after you with these administrative things, you know, if you don't shape up and start being a little more loyal. So it's that kind of techniques. There's also like picking up the phone and calling advertisers. TV Doge, which was an independent TV channel that started much later, they did something the Kremlin didn't like. Suddenly their landlord said, sorry, we're canceling your lease. Their advertisers said, we're not going to advertise anymore. They were carried on cable channels, and the cable companies said, we're dropping you. And, you know, nobody had to say, you've done a terrible thing, you're lousy journalists, you're unethical, whatever. They're being squeezed financially. They did survive, but, you know, obviously these things have a huge impact on the journalism. TV Doge kept fighting and still exists today, but now all the independent journalists, or virtually all of them, are operating from exile. Their audience is greatly reduced. They're blocked within Russia. Many other things were done by Putin, but that was kind of the beginning of that playbook, and I think it's what, you know, elements of that have been used in Turkey, used in Hungary, and in lots of other places. So if you hear somebody saying Trump is following Orban's playbook, just remember that Orban was following Putin's playbook.
And Putin, in some respects, was following Silvio Berlusconi's.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much background to give, so I'm just going to say that 90% of Turkish media is pro-government or owned by government-friendly organizations, and the remaining 10% is very vibrant and diversified. And I want to highlight so many things, but we have so little time. I run a news organization. I have staff that works in parliament. They are asked which party we support. And, you know, I went to school in the US. We're taught that we don't support parties as journalists. But that's in Turkey, parties have newspapers. And those newspapers are always publishing positive things about those parties. So people really don't get what we're doing. I'm trying to make it work. We have a Turkish language service, which is called Studio Recap. Very talented journalists. One of them worked for Voice of America and was fired recently because of the cuts here in the US. Very talented, big names, very proud of what we're doing, but when we're saying we are being unbiased, we don't want to be supporting any specific agenda, we're presenting all the information that's happening in Ankara every day, people just get very suspicious. They don't believe that you can be unbiased, and that's a product of polarization. And I think you're seeing that here in the US too. If you say specific words, you're on a certain team, and then we can't listen to you. And then that's where nothing works, is how I would say. Because if you all of a sudden get framed with this team or that team, and you're only playing for their purposes, who's going to believe you? How do you make an information environment? And I think that's the real challenge that we face now as information makers. Because if you have Grokpedia, changing what information is. And then that's the base layer of the internet, right? You have information storage areas, and then those feed AI, and then AI feeds you what Grokpedia decides is true. We're heading to a disaster on what actually happened in the world, in history, and everything's being digitized right now as we speak. I believe, maybe I've been in Turkey too long, that Grokpedia is a conspiracy to feed AI bots specific talking points that Musk supports. And I do this, I say this as a former marketing professional. I did SEO, search engine optimization. We did boost specific keywords on the internet. I know how this stuff works. I have an idea that AI is going to be much worse. And I do believe Grokpedia is part of an information architecture project. Don't want to sound crazy, but that's what I think about at night. Where am I going with this? In Turkey, to give specific examples, we have these guys. It's not as bad as Russia, but I do think that there's a shocking element to these people showing up at your door, and ICE agents in Minnesota. And in Turkey right now, we've had much darker periods. This feels like a very dark period, but in the post-coup, there was a 2016 coup attempt. There were crackdowns, purges, mass arrests. I was sitting at a bar and just police come and surround the bar and ID everybody. That's not fun, right? That feels like something out of a movie that I didn't know I'd take part in. So the shocking factor that's happening now is that celebrities in Turkey, big names, musicians, TV stars, get these guys maybe not so aggressively dressed at their door, and they get drug tested. If their drug tests come out positive, they go to jail. And why is this happening? Because the government's making examples of big names to silence less big names or average citizens. So you have the shock factor. I think ICE is part of that. I don't want to make too many comparisons. I don't live here. I only have time to follow Turkish politics. It keeps me busy enough. To give you another example of what I experienced, because we have local journalists, they're at high risk all the time, lose their jobs, go to jail. We also have foreign journalists in Turkey. We have less than before because there's less money in journalism every year. But we have foreign journalists, and just to explain to you a little bit of what we live in, everybody needs a visa to be in a country. In Turkey, your visa is tied to your press card. You have to renew your press card every year, and then you get a visa for 1 year. Sometimes what you write is reviewed. It's a very painful process for many people. It's very bureaucratic, very slow. And your ability to work as a professional journalist depends on that press card. So when people lose it, they get deported, but by not being deported, they just get deported by not having permission to be there. And I've seen this happen to many people who got too close to some borders or went to the wrong place during the wrong event. Just recently there was, during these Syria conflicts, clashes in these recent weeks, a French journalist was arrested for going to a protest in Istanbul, just doing his job. He's taking photos. I don't know if he was interviewing people, but he got arrested for being there doing his job. So what this results in, I work sometimes for AFP, Agence France Presse. I take videos for them of protests. What this results in is that many times I'm the only foreign journalist at these protests because many foreign journalists do not want to risk their press credentials and their ability to be in Turkey on one protest. So the photo that was up earlier is from a trans rights protest. Yeah, 100%. It's local photographers and me. And I'm always wondering, where are the other foreigners? Because there's New York Times in Istanbul, there's plenty of other journalists there, and they're not documenting it. They have to choose, yeah, this one. So this was a trans rights protest. They're not documenting, they're not doing their job. You have to make decisions. If I cover this protest, then I won't get that interview. And then that's self-censorship, right? The reason that I'm able to do what I do is because I never got press credentials. I did my job, I covered conflicts in the Southeast, and I'm married. So my visa is my marriage ring. That's why I stay in Turkey, and that's why I do what I do, because I think I'm one of the few people in this unique place to just push. Other people do not have that luxury, especially local journalists. So I feel it's a responsibility to document information, put it somewhere, and compete with these invented narratives from the government, from Elon Musk, from all these people that just want to tell history their way, which is like the history of humanity, to change how we understand ourselves and who has power, and push against that, because we're in this critical moment, and obviously governments are not acting, so I don't know, we need to just do what we can, and I'm really trying to do that in Turkey because that's where I am.
Do you yourself get threatened, though? I mean, if you're there
gonna,
taking pictures, you are pretty clearly a journalist.
This is going to be on the internet. I'm happy to talk about specifics after, individually. I have been detained. I've had plenty of experiences. I've had my photos deleted from my camera, interrogations. I can go into more specifics, yes. But I don't have the press card. I already lost my privileges. So, you know.
Another day in the life of a journalist in an authoritarian country.
And again, I'm lucky. I'm not trying to say I'm doing it. I'm trying to give work to people and make space for narratives to exist.
Diego, you raised this point early on in your comment just now about the issue of sort of being trusted as a reliable and impartial source of information as opposed to kind of a partisan hack, right? And we were talking about how journalists, the journalism profession in the Soviet Union had been, distrusted for good reason, and how journalists work to regain that trust. And I want to pick up on that theme of trust as a sort of really essential currency of this profession and of this industry. I was struck by something that I heard on Recap Radio, Diego, quite recently, when one of your guests, Carol Wasilewski, observed that whereas authoritarian regimes of old relied on kind of ham-fisted propaganda, the contemporary authoritarian strategy is more shrewd than that, and involves disinformation and misinformation and an attack on trust and trustworthiness itself, right? Which is why terms like gaslighting have become sort of so prominent, right? There's a subtle strategy of undermining trust in information, which, in a healthy democracy, you want sort of citizens to be skeptical about what they hear in media savvy and so on. But this seems to be at a deeper sort of epistemological level of, are you going to trust your blind eyes, or are you going to trust, what your fellow partisans are telling you? So I wondered if you could say a little bit about, this, and of course, the strategy is corrosive to all of society, because society is built on trust. Our ability to cooperate with each other, coordinate with each other, depends to a great extent on trust. But journalism, to a particular extent, is built on the ability of the public to trust you as a sort of impartial and fair and transparent source of information. And I'm wondering if you have ideas about how that challenge can be met when trust is being deliberately undermined through information manipulation. Diego, you gave the example of Grok, which is another dimension of this challenge. Anne's example of journalism having lost its trust and journalists regaining that trust during that transition maybe gives us some reason for hope. So I wondered if you could reflect on, how we climb out of this.
Well, in terms of Russia, because it's very bleak. You know, Putin went from the early playbook techniques to, you know, gradually, well, not even gradually, but sort of in spurts, there would be, you know, a big crackdown. And then, you know, and you'd think, okay, it's over. I once wrote something about, I've written more than one obituary for Russian independent media, and then they would come back, and it was great. It was exciting. I don't see how they're coming back this time. You know, some of the more recent things that have been done is the Foreign Agents Law, which is used against journalists and others, and that's part of the Putin playbook that has been copied in other countries. It didn't like put your media outlet out of business, but it said it is a foreign agent, or you are a foreign agent, and you have to make all these disclosures. I don't know if anybody's seen this documentary, My Undesirable Friends. It's about TV Doge and the, you know, sort of the run-up to the invasion of Ukraine, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and then I actually haven't seen the rest of it, the aftermath when everybody goes into exile. But you know, they're kind of laughing about it, but in a very gallows humor kind of way. That, you know, I'm a foreign agent, or I'm labeled undesirable, which was worse than a foreign agent. And so after the invasion, you know, it became clear to independent journalists, we can't stay here. This time it really is over. We're all going to end up in jail. And so there, you know, different newsrooms have gone to Riga, Latvia, or to Amsterdam, or to Berlin, and they're continuing to do their work and putting it out there on the internet, but it's blocked in Russia. You can access the sites via VPN, but there are plenty of people who don't want to do that, don't know how to do that, and so they're left with nothing but everything, you know, all the media that's now really completely controlled by the Kremlin. And you know, I don't see how they recover because they have to operate from exile. They are reaching some audience, but it's not enough. And, you know, people say, well, Putin won't be here forever. Okay, maybe he won't be, but who knows what follows him. Anyway, that's my take. It's pretty bleak.
Yeah, I don't know if people came here for optimism.
Wrong room.
But we're here for you. Let's see. So trust. Okay. I think journalists need to rethink their role in society. I think we are information providers, and we have biases. Everybody has bias. We're human. And I think that, especially in American journalism, we pretend, we're told that we don't have opinions, and we tell the truth, and we defend democracy. And we got to be honest and just say we have huge egos and want your attention. You know, and that's how Joe Rogan wins, right? Because Joe Rogan's being himself, and he's being honest, and he's talking about things that matter to him, and so are we. What we don't cover is a bias. If I choose to cover that thing but not this, is a huge bias. Including Greenland, by the way. Somebody's got to explain this to me at the end of the night, what's going on. So, be human, reassess the role, and then what's that look like on paper? I think Semaphore is doing something interesting, where they have an article, the facts, one section, a counter-argument from somebody that disagrees with whatever the story is. So you have some intellectual discourse right there on the paper, and then you have the journalist's point of view. Because journalists also pretend that they have no idea what's going on, and that we have no opinions. Of course we have opinions. We're some of the most informed people in society because we talk to people from all groups. I find that the profession is very rich, not monetarily, very rich in discourse because we get to talk to, Islamists, Trump voters, everybody. And then you understand that what shared humanity we have, which is a very beautiful place to operate. Some people just stay in their bubbles, and that seems really sad for me sometimes, echo chambers. So, of course, journalists have opinions. We should make those clear, and then kind of try to make our reporting, these are my opinions, you can disagree with me, try to make our reporting clear. So I try to break up what I do with analysis and facts, and the jokes, honestly, are because everything's so miserable and sad. So I add jokes because I used to be an environmental reporter before it was cool, before Greta Thunberg, when Al Gore made that movie, Inconvenient Truth. Yeah, I was a climate reporter at the Star Ledger in Newark. I've been writing miserable stuff forever, and nobody pays attention. So you got to sprinkle a little sugar, a little pun, and maybe some people will pay attention because it's painful to read the news. And like I said, exhaustion is the point. If you're not paying attention, if you stop your subscription to whatever magazine because you're so tired of the bad news, they win. You're giving them the road to just, do their military parade over you.
So, I'm in my effort to maybe try to steer us out of the bleakness. I wonder if you see any kind of emerging. You both you worked for very different your experiences in very different kinds of media organizations, and you were with NPR, which is sort of the paragon of the sort of respected legacy media organization. And Diego, you started your own kind of media organization that disseminates sort of digitally, and that's a very different model. And the two have sort of, I imagine, different advantages and drawbacks, particularly in kind of repressive or polarized or kind of challenging information environments. So I wonder if you could kind of reflect on whether sort of these whether different kinds of actors in the media landscape have maybe more nimble in getting around the kinds of challenges and restrictions that we've been talking about.
I feel like I keep going back to ancient history, but when I was at CPJ, the internet was still fairly new, and we started getting these reports from China about people putting things on the internet that were, not appearing in the papers because it was like Soviet control. Everything was very tightly controlled, and we had to have this discussion of what do we do about this. These people are not journalists in the traditional sense, but on the other hand, traditional journalists in China are all working for state-controlled media, and they're not doing, independent reporting. But we were very excited that, here was this thing where you could get some information out that, was otherwise never going to be seen by people. And so we kind of came up with this definition that they were acting journalistically, and we defended them. We took up their cases. And it just seemed like, wow, this is opening up so many possibilities until governments started, figuring out ways to use the internet with their own messaging, or to build the Great Firewall as they did in China. So I feel like it's this cat and mouse game, but on the other hand, what we've seen in the last, whatever it is, week, 10 days or something in Minneapolis is, thank goodness that we now have the technology for people to be able to pick up their phones and record something, and a platform to put it out on. And, what if that didn't exist? What would we know about Minneapolis? What would the narrative be? How would the, protesters, the Democratic officials in Minnesota, how would they be able to counter Kristi Noem and, you know, the whole messaging from the Trump administration. So there's, you know, the internet turned out to be not the wonderful panacea that we all believed, but it still is a great thing, and it offers opportunities like that for the truth to come out, you know. You can see this with your own eyes. Don't listen to the administration telling you that your lies are, or that your eyes are lying to you.
I'm not sure. You're saying what's the difference between legacy media and digital, and what are the opportunities to make space? I'm really not sure, because it's so easy to block websites. And the main thing I really enjoyed while being here in the US is reading the news without VPNs and flipping this, flipping that, changing my browser. It was nice because all the stuff, all the Syrian news sources are blocked in Turkey. So we have more abilities to spread messages, but also more ability to block them. Because honestly, how many images do you see out of northeast Syria? You know, there's a siege, people are in the cold. We saw plenty out of Gaza. There's a pretty big clampdown on specific areas of the world, and we know nothing about them. And if we don't know about them, nothing changes there, right? What are the opportunities for new people? I really think it remains to be seen, and I do think we're at an inflection point for information. I think we all understand AI is going to take our jobs at some point and change the way that things are going to work moving forward, like the internet. I do remain hopeful because when I was in my 20s, before smartphones, we really looked at mass surveillance in the war on terror as a very negative thing. Having cameras everywhere, governments tracking you, smartphones, another camera in your pocket, they know where you are. Yeah, we were paranoid and all, but where did Black Lives Matter come from? It came from cell phone cameras, right? Having more cameras around actually led to some justice movements. I believe AI can do that too if people participate in the creation of the rules and the framework that this technology is going to operate in. We need to learn from the past. We're not good at that. Tech companies don't care about us. But I think that there are opportunities, and we really have to look at how AI is going to unfold. There could be positive outcomes from it, just like mass surveillance.
Let's take some questions from our audience. So,
Yeah. Thanks so much for a great talk. I wanted to hear more maybe about how your subject matter has changed. You showed us this fantastic photo at the trans pride parade, or and mentioned that a lot of people don't show up to many of these places. So one I'll just say a little glimpse of hope is there is something called what I call the resilience of resistance. Meaning in Turkey, people are coming out different ways, different strategies. So how is your, specifically in Turkey, how has your work changed in terms of subject matter, of who you cover, how you cover them, and how do you get these voices out by covering them? Over the last decade, because you mentioned after the coup, it was more difficult. But voices also changed, I imagine. Also.
So I can give a really clear example. I went to Turkey not to write about Turkish politics. I was interested in refugees. I covered the refugee migration, mass migration to Europe in 2015-16. That's the main reason I went. I covered Turkey because a coup attempt happened while I was there. And I said, okay, what's going on here? And I went to many refugee camps in Turkey. Syrians migrated to Turkey during the war in Syria. Many of them got very bad jobs in Turkey for very bad wages. Many of those jobs were agricultural. And I would go into the fields and take pictures of these people working, Syrians working for really shameful wages. They also, it's something out of the jungle, if anybody read that. Like they had to pay for their tents near the fields. And they didn't even have water. It's ridiculous. Documented it, I think that was 2016. I went back with an NGO, I think 2023, complete lockdown. Can't enter this area, police are patrolling, can't document. So how has my subject matter changed? There's been more limitations on the things I used to cover. I can't even access some things anymore. Some people would say, why don't you talk to the government? Government doesn't talk to us. So in the past, AKP officials would speak sometimes to the media. Now it's quite difficult. So they say, then in an authoritarian context, they say, yeah, but you're always talking to the opposition, you're platforming them. It's like, yeah, you don't respond to my emails. You don't respond to my calls. So I think that these limitations, like all organisms, shape what you do and how you act. And then sometimes I need to think about your question more. I'm sure that it's changed my habits. Just like VPN, sometimes I get lazy. I don't turn it on, and then I don't read that news, and then I totally miss a complete story.
Yes, and if you feel comfortable doing so, please tell us who you are.
I'll just stand up so I can see both of you. Firstly, thank you very much for holding this panel and for touching on all of the strategies that authoritarian governments. As a student of political science here at Columbia, my name is Lyra, and I'm an undergraduate student here. I really appreciate all the insights that you shared from your experience and your observations. My question was on the reception of journalism. So a lot of the talk so far has been on disinformation, access to information, or the lack thereof. But there's also the issue of people's lack of concern, or in my generation, at least I can speak from my own experience, we are informed. A lot of us do have ways of accessing information. We know how to navigate the internet. We know how to go through, the walls, the monetary walls to reach that piece of information. But that still does not overcome the general culture of apathy that we also observe. There is a will to learn more, but then the will to effectuate change is sometimes not prevalent. So what could journalism or contemporary journalism do in that direction? I'd just love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
It's really, well, I haven't been in Russia since 2015, and I'm actually now, and along with a number of other people from the Harriman Institute, was supposedly permanently banned from going there. And I have trouble understanding, I don't really watch much of the Russian media, but every once in a while I see, a clip of some of the absolutely atrocious stuff that's on Russian TV, and I think, how can people be watching this? And okay, I understand the thing about it's, if you're older, you don't even know what VPN is, it's a lot of trouble, or it seems like a lot of trouble, and it's easier to just turn on the TV and listen to that. And it really is atrocious and very, very propagandistic. And I don't really have a good answer for how you overcome that. But I will say, we talked about writing the obituary for independent journalism. And certainly when everybody went into exile, I thought, okay, maybe this time it's real, But at least for now, there's several really important news organizations that are continuing to work, putting their material on Telegram, which hasn't been shut down yet, and so people can access it. That might be, I'm no expert on this, but it might be like the easiest way to get some of their content, if you're not, if you don't want to use VPN or don't know how to use it. And I guess, again, like the technology that we have today is enabling them to live in Berlin and still do some reporting. And, they do have some people still on the ground as well who are helping, feed them stuff. But in terms of Russia, I just think, you got to keep fighting. You got to keep doing what you're doing. You got to keep searching for that audience, trying to draw that audience in. And I don't know, I know there are some estimates of like how many people are routinely read Medusa, which is like larger independents. I don't know what those numbers are. They're not insignificant, but they're not huge either. And I think if you're going to try to not be a pessimist, you have to believe that that's important and keep up the fight and just keep doing your job, keep getting the truth out, keep trying to fight to give this information and doing whatever you can to get that to the audience that really needs to hear that, which isn't necessarily us.
I'd love to talk more because I'm trying to reach people like you and very interested in what you'd like to know. Actively, with our Turkish language coverage, we try to have the same information in different ways. I'm a big believer in the medium is the message. Where you get your information is part of what you get from it, because some people prefer listening, some people prefer watching, some people prefer reading. So what I'm actively trying to do with our Turkish language content is we have written political coverage daily for people that want it that way. We have it on our podcast, we have it on video, and then we cut it up into shorts on social media. And hopefully one of those is good for people. I don't think you can motivate people to follow politics if they don't want to. I think, it's there if you want it. If you don't want it, you'll want it eventually when you start realizing that you can't afford your life, which is happening to a lot of people, right? War is interested, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. I think you will get interested in the stuff when you need to. If you have a comfortable life, being apolitical is a luxury. I think that's the way it goes. If you don't need to think about politics, great. You're one of the very few people that gets to do that. But I think diversification of the message and not forcing people, because it's not vitamins, right? I'm not forcing you to eat broccoli by following politics. You could say relate it to people's daily lives. I know that the last election, how many thousand voters in Pennsylvania decided what's going to happen in Ukraine and Ukraine funding. I don't know how to make that understandable to people who are thinking about their family and how to feed them. I think, glad to hear your suggestions, open to comments.
So, if I may say something about this as well, speaking as a political scientist, right, apathy can be a perfectly rational response. If you feel utterly powerless, right, to change things, what's the point? Sometimes people call that the rational ignorance thesis. It could be a rational response to what you were saying, Diego, earlier about like distraction being the point, right? Like sending people's attention scurrying in a billion directions at once, where you just sort of give up trying to understand because everything is sort of so unintelligibly crazy all the time. But on the other hand, there's some political science research that shows that as repression increases, political participation tends to increase, right? Like even though it's sort of pointless to go and vote in an election where the autocrat is likely to win, people seem to do it anyway. Or even if you know that going to this protest is very risky for you personally and it's not going to change anything, people seem to show up anyway, right? So it's like when conditions seem to get sort of dire and repressive enough, it seems to awaken interested people who otherwise may not. Tim Fry, yeah.
Great, Tim Fry from the Political Science Department. First, you made a really important point that in Turkey, the media is 90% controlled by the government. And we saw this in Russia for a long time as well. We see it in Hungary, that there are still these pockets of people like you doing really important work. It might not seem that way, but now having seen Russia go from the situation of having a pocket of independent media to not having it. We really miss it. It's really important. And one can imagine in a different political setting that 10%, we saw this in Peru under Fujimori, when the one tiny independent media leaked tapes about corruption, led to the downfall of the government. So in a different political setting, independent media might be really well positioned. So I'll put my political scientist hat on, because we had these arguments about why it was good for the autocrat to have 90% control and to have these pockets of independent media. They could say, oh look, we have, we're just like you in democratic countries, because look, we have Diego, and he's we have this independent journalist here, or or they make it really difficult to report, but that there might be reasons why they might exist, and we believed those arguments in Russia until the war happened, or even before the war, and they the calculus changed, and so I guess the question is, in Turkey, do you think it's that your position 5 years from now, 2 years from now, do you think that there is this kind of stability, there is a reason for you to exist, to continue to exist? Or is it just that the state says there's nothing we can do about it? Because they could shut you down, but they don't. So
yeah, I'll put the same question to Schumer for the Democrats. What's his role? Why is he still around? Somebody told me. So I understand what you're saying. It's weird. I don't know. I feel like so many people digest what's happening around them in so many different ways. Because when I first moved there in Turkey in 2015, there was the war happening in the southeast, and there were protests. And I was working part-time as an English teacher. And I remember these protests were happening in front of the place I was teaching on the main street of Istanbul, Istiklal. And people were getting beaten and arrested. And one of my students got up and just pointed down and said, "This is democracy." He said, "We allow them to do this." I said, "Yeah, but they're getting beat up." And he said, "Yeah, but they can't protest. So that means that we have democracy." I said, "I don't know what to do with this." So I think everybody processes to survive. But yeah, there are fake oppositions and Schumers, which allow legitimacy for governments that are going to do what they want anyway, 100%. I guess our job is to give hope and push them a little over the line. I mean, you have politicians who voice their opinions and do it well. I don't know if media changes whether they get opportunities or not, but I'm glad to hear your thoughts.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Ruby. I'm a senior studying history at Columbia, and I'm entering the media landscape. I'll be moving to Texas at the end of the year. So I just wanted to ask, as an independent reporter, you mentioned bias earlier on, and its power, the power of acknowledging it. And I just wanted to ask how you feel about journalists becoming part of the story. Like, do you think that's a responsible practice? Because I see my generation engaging with it, and there's this feeling that, the legacy media is just, it's impersonal, and like it's sort of overly manicured. Do you think being part of the story is okay?
Yeah, it's a hard case-by-case situation. I think that there's a lot of value to working in legacy media. I worked in legacy media, and that's where I understood what the value system is. Mm-hmm. If I was doing that with my cell phone in my room at home, I don't know what conclusions I would have come to. If I was starting as a journalist today, live streaming and talking into a phone, I would not have had the lessons from being in a newsroom. I think it is important to have some kind of structure, and maybe what we need to do is have something like Committee to Protect Journalists, or different institutions that give the grounding to new journalists of what it means to do this job. Because yeah, I work with young journalists in Turkey that think, you know, you don't have to quote somebody perfectly, right? They're like, they kind of said that. And like, no, we need the exact words. And you need somebody to teach you. You need, apprenticeship. And you can do that through online courses. I continue to take online courses through the Knight Center, Knight Foundation of Journalism. Absolute love it. And you know, all of you can continue your education after being in school because things are going to change. Right? What I was taught was how to edit on paper. I don't know why. It was 2006 when I graduated. I'm going to ask my teachers about that actually next week. So I would just say self-education. Maybe we need some organizations that oversee it. And yeah, legacy media has a role. And I think that it's so many people are just egomaniacs. So, you know, they want to be in front of a camera and tell their story their way. And yeah, journalism is a profession in the end. And an influencer is something else. A marketer is something else. A politician is something else. The journalist needs to try to convey information to the public. Unfortunately, everybody can call themselves a journalist.
Yeah, the rise of Substack to me is really interesting because then you see this sort of like middle ground where there's these like, I mean, like Ken and Cliff and Steve, like these people who worked on legacy media who are now going and doing their own thing. So
There's no jobs. There's no jobs. I talk to people all the time. They pitch magazines, and the magazines have no room for them. So they're starting Substacks because they have no choice.
Okay.
And Substack is not a perfect platform.
No.
They take 10% of your income to send emails kind of well. Like they don't even send all of them. It's just a sign that the industry is struggling, and this is the only place we got.
And do you have any advice for Ruby?
Yeah, so, you know, I sort of came up in journalism at a time when we were not the story. You didn't put yourself into the story. And then when I taught at the journalism school here, at some point, I don't know, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, something like that, you know, students would turn in their stories and it would be I. And I'm like, no, we're not doing that. And then, you know, I sort of came around to sometimes yes. It is case by case. And I've done it myself. Actually, I did a long research project on a lot of the history that I've talked about today, the Soviet media and then Russian media and what's happened. And I had a fellowship at the Shorenstein Center, and I was struggling with how to write this thing. And one of the professors there said, put yourself in it, because you had been, you know, you were there as a reporter, and then you were there as a press freedom advocate, and then you were there as a professor talking to your students about this. And it just, the whole thing came together in that way. I wouldn't say it was all about me, but I could use my thoughts and reactions, like at the end of 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, we all thought, yay, this is so great. And it was kind of important to say that. It set the tone for, you know, so things started out with a lot of optimism, but then this happened and that happened. So think about, how can I justify my being in this story?
Yeah.
And don't use it all the time.
Okay. Do you find that people respond positively? Like when you, like that decision, do you feel like putting yourself in the story was something that made people?
Yeah, I think it's done so much now, certainly on Substack and lots of other places. And you know, even in the New York Times, you'll see it. I've seen, particularly in videos, like they've done some videos out of Minneapolis, you know. I was there, and then this happened, and that happened. I mean, the journalist is an eyewitness, or, you know, if not an eyewitness to the actual shooting, was nearby and got there very quickly. And so it's another form of storytelling that can be very effective. But just think about what, you know, is that the best way to tell this story?
I think it goes to the trust thing too. I don't do it. Personally, I wasn't trained to do it. I don't like to put myself in stories, but...
Just the puns.
Yeah, those are biased too. I think it goes to trust, and then sometimes it helps build trust with the audience.
Yeah.
If you say who you are, why you do stuff. If you're just some mysterious guy, you know, or a woman doing reporting, people do have questions. Who are you? Why you do this? So yeah, I would just say it helps build trust. I think that a little bit helps, a little bit, but it's such a fine line and case by case. It really depends on how you do it.
Yeah, and there's, you know, the New York Times, I don't know what they call this feature, but I still get, on some days I get the print version and it's on page 2, and there might be something every day and it's like sort of the story behind the story, or how I got that story, or how I wrestled with this decision that had to be made. Those are really interesting, at least to a journalist. And so it's, you know, being more transparent and informative in a way. So that's another thing, you know, maybe you write your story, but then there's room for something more that's, you know, I'm going to tell you a first-person story that's going to tell you a little more about what I told you in the more standard, you know, legacy media.
Yeah, it goes back to sort of multimedia.
Can we take another question? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
In the very back, yeah, thank you.
Hi, just to kind of continue the conversation from a different angle. I'm from Columbia Journalism School, and my name is Agna. I'm actually from Lithuania. I'm wondering, you guys spoke a lot about covering under authoritarian regimes. I think that's kind of, there is an incentive there to do the opposite of hide yourself, either under pseudonyms or pen names, or maybe compromises. You guys have talked by taking bribes, or maybe not going to a certain protest. And you touched upon this, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, especially nowadays, because maybe I'm naive and young and I don't understand, but for me it seems like right now the incentive to compromise is even higher, because there's less and less places to escape. Before, you could think that, oh, worst case scenario, I could go to the United States, for example. But that does not seem to be a very viable option, more and more so as life goes on. And then, you know, if you don't compromise, you get ousted very easily and you cannot continue to do work, and you are blindsided and you have a North Korea type of situation. So I'm wondering, how do you balance that? And if you do compromise, how do you not lose sanity? Or have you seen people in the past not lose sanity and not give in to the stories completely if they do compromise?
That's I think the easiest way is to ask yourself why you're doing the job. So if you're doing it to write stories that you think are important and you can't, consider another career if you can't do them. Honestly, that's the easiest way. You don't have to do journalism. If you're doing it to do journalism, it is a passion-driven career choice. It's not a logical career choice for most people. If you got to do it, you're going to do it. And how do you stay sane? I know that different people have different conditions and they really struggle and they get punished for what they do. I think that Hrant Dink, the Armenian journalist in Turkey who was assassinated in 2009? Seven? Thank you. Hrant Dink said, and I might need your help, if I'm gonna fall, I might as well fall while I'm standing. Something like this, right? I want to be standing when I go down. And he was, when he was.
And not on my knees or something.
Yeah, not on my knees. I think it's, yeah, but you need to be in a place of privilege. Some people gotta work for money, right? Like, journalism is not a place to do money or have sanity for most people. And it's a choice. So make sure it's the choice you want.
But if you go back to Lithuania and work as a journalist, you are working in one of the freedom press environments in the whole world.
So far.
So far, yes. I understand LRT is under fire.
I am so glad we found an optimistic note to end on. Lithuania is an oppressive environment. Please join me in thanking our speakers.